You were never the problem in the relationship with the avoidant person. Never too much, or too needy, or too demanding, or too sensitive, or any of the things they suggested or implied about you to deflect from the real issue, which was not any inadequacy or failing on your part, but was their inability to handle your capacity to see through their defenses, to perceive their authentic wounded self beneath the independent facade they show the world, to recognize their patterns as protection mechanisms rather than as their true nature, to understand their behavior as fear-driven rather than as genuine preference for distance and emotional unavailability. The avoidants spent their entire life constructing a defensive structure designed to prevent people from seeing their real self, from perceiving their wounds, from recognizing their patterns, from understanding their fears. And most people cooperate with this defensive structure by accepting the facade at face value, by believing the independence is real rather than compensatory, by interpreting the emotional distance as lack of caring rather than as terror of vulnerability, by taking the withdrawal at face value rather than recognizing it as a defensive response to intimacy anxiety. But you didn't cooperate. You saw through them. You perceive the fear beneath the independence, the wounds beneath the defensiveness, the longing for connection beneath the insistence on distance, the vulnerability beneath the emotional unavailability. This seeing, this accurate perception of who they really were beneath their protective layers was simultaneously what made you special and what made you threatening. Special because being truly seen is a profound gift that their wounded heart has always needed. Threatening because being seen means being vulnerable in ways their defensive system cannot tolerate. Means being known in ways that create the exact exposure and lack of control that their patterns are designed to prevent. The avoidant couldn't handle your ability to see them, not because you were wrong in your perceptions, but because you were right in ways that penetrated their defenses. Not because you saw things that weren't there, but because you saw things that were there, but were meant to remain hidden. Not because you were too sensitive or too analytical, but because you were too perceptive and they needed someone who would accept their facade without looking beneath it, who would let them maintain their defenses without challenge, who would interact with their protected surface without accessing their authentic wounded self. Your ability to see them accurately, to name their patterns, to understand their behavior, to perceive their authentic feelings beneath their defended actions created a fundamental incompatibility. Not because seeing them was wrong, but because they cannot sustain a relationship with someone who sees them clearly when their entire defensive structure is built on preventing being seen. The avoidant person's defensive system was specifically triggered by particular aspects of your perceptiveness and your capacity to see through their protective layers. Understanding how your seeing triggered their defenses reveals why your accurate perception was experienced as a threat rather than as the gift it actually represented. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you recognized their independence as compensation for early abandonment rather than as an authentic personality trait, eliminating their primary defensive narrative. The avoidant's entire self-presentation is built on appearing independently minded, self-sufficient, not needing others. This independence is how they understand themselves and how they present themselves to the world. But you saw through this presentation to recognize the independence was not an authentic preference, but was a compensatory mechanism developed in response to childhood experiences where depending on others led to disappointment or abandonment. You understood their independence as, I don't need anyone because needing people wasn't safe, rather than a genuine preference for solitude. This recognition threatened their core defensive narrative. If their independence is compensation rather than an authentic trait, then their entire self-understanding is a defensive construction rather than a genuine identity. This threatens the foundation of their self-image and their justification for their patterns. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you identified their patterns as patterns rather than as isolated incidents, proving systematic dysfunction they wanted to deny. The avoidant can defend against observations about single behaviors by framing them as isolated incidents, one-time responses to specific circumstances. But you saw patterns. You recognized that withdrawal after intimacy was not an isolated incident, but was a consistent pattern. You identified that hot and cold behavior wasn't random, but was a predictable cycle. You named the pattern of creating distance when closeness developed. This pattern recognition eliminated their ability to frame behaviors as isolated incidents and forced recognition of systematic patterns, of predictable responses, of consistent dysfunction. This pattern recognition was threatening because patterns indicate core issues that require addressing rather than isolated behaviors that can be explained away or minimized. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you correctly interpreted their withdrawal as fear rather than as lack of caring, removing the cover story they used to justify creating distance. When the avoidant withdraws, they frame it to themselves and others as needing space, being overwhelmed by other commitments, naturally processing things alone. But you saw through these explanations to recognize withdrawal as a fear response, fear of vulnerability that closeness was creating, fear of being hurt if they became too attached, fear of losing themselves in relationship. This accurate identification of withdrawal as fear-driven rather than as a legitimate preference for space threatened their defensive narrative because it reframed their behavior from reasonable boundary setting to fear-driven avoidance, from mature self-knowledge to dysfunction requiring addressing. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you perceived their authentic feelings beneath their defended actions, proving the disconnect between what they felt and what they showed. The avoidant maintains control by showing only what they choose to show, by keeping their authentic feelings hidden beneath a defended exterior. But you could see beneath the defense to their actual feelings. You recognized they cared more than they showed. You perceived they were hurt when they acted unaffected. You understood they wanted closeness even while creating distance. This perception of their authentic feelings beneath their defended presentations was threatening because it proved they weren't in control of what was visible, weren't successfully hiding their vulnerability, weren't maintaining the defended exterior as effectively as they believed. Being unable to control what you perceived about them created a profound threat to their need for control over their self-presentation. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you named their behavior as avoidant attachment style, providing a framework that explained their patterns in ways that eliminated their individual justifications. The avoidant could defend each behavior individually with specific explanations. This withdrawal was because of work stress. This emotional unavailability was because of their personality. This pattern was because of legitimate preferences. But when you named their patterns as avoidant attachment style, you provided an overarching framework that explained all behaviors as manifestations of a single underlying issue. This framework eliminated their ability to justify behaviors individually and forced recognition that all patterns stemmed from an attachment wound. This was threatening because it reframed scattered behaviors as symptoms of a core dysfunction, making their patterns less about legitimate individual preferences and more about a systematic issue requiring therapeutic intervention. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you remained calm and clear in your observations rather than becoming emotional in ways they could dismiss. The avoidant can defend against observations delivered emotionally by focusing on the delivery rather than the content. You're too emotional. You're overreacting. You're being dramatic. This allows them to dismiss valid observations by attacking emotional tone. But you delivered observations calmly, clearly, factually. You named patterns without accusation. You identified behaviors without drama. This calm clarity removed their ability to dismiss your observations based on emotional delivery and forced them to engage with the content of what you were saying, which was accurate and damning and impossible to defend against without resorting to denial that would be obviously dishonest given your specificity and accuracy. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because you communicated that you saw their potential alongside their current limitations, creating pressure to grow toward potential they'd rather avoid confronting. The avoidant can handle being dismissed as damaged or being accepted without challenge, but you did neither. You saw who they were, wounded, defended, limited in current capacity, and you also saw who they could become, healed, open, capable of genuine intimacy. This simultaneous seeing of current reality and future potential created implicit pressure to grow, implicit challenge to close the gap between who they were and who they could be. This was threatening because it eliminated both the comfort of being dismissed, which would justify their patterns, and the comfort of being accepted without challenge, which would allow patterns to continue. Your seeing of their potential created an expectation they weren't ready to meet. Your ability to see them triggered their defenses because your perceptiveness proved you were emotionally intelligent and psychologically sophisticated in ways that made you dangerous to their defensive system. If you'd been less perceptive, less emotionally intelligent, less psychologically sophisticated, you would have been safer to be with because you wouldn't have been able to see through their defenses. But your sophistication meant you could perceive what they were hiding, name what they weren't saying, understand dynamics they weren't consciously aware of. This level of perceptiveness made you fundamentally dangerous to a defensive system built on hiding the authentic self and maintaining control through keeping others at a surface level. Your intelligence and insight weren't flaws. They were threats to defenses that required keeping partners who couldn't see clearly. The avoidant person experienced your accurate seeing of them as more threatening than the loneliness of being without you, choosing isolation over the vulnerability that being with someone who saw them clearly required. Understanding why being seen felt more threatening than loneliness reveals the depth of their terror of vulnerability and the power of their defensive priorities over their need for connection. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because it activated their core wound about being unacceptable, making them believe the true knowledge of them would lead to inevitable rejection. The avoidant carries a deep wound from childhood experiences where being their authentic self, showing their needs, expressing their feelings led to rejection, abandonment, or punishment. This created a core belief that their authentic self is unacceptable, that being truly known will lead to being rejected when the knower understands who they really are. When you saw them clearly, when you perceived beneath their defenses, it activated this core wound. You saw their real self, and their wound said this meant rejection was coming. Even though you responded to seeing them with acceptance rather than rejection, their wound couldn't trust this acceptance, couldn't believe you'd continue accepting once you understood them fully. Being alone felt safer than being with you because being alone meant no risk of the anticipated rejection that being truly known would eventually bring. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because your seeing removed their control over their self-presentation, creating vulnerability their system cannot tolerate. The avoidant maintains a sense of safety through control, controlling what they show, controlling what others perceive, controlling their self-presentation. This control creates an illusion of safety where they're only as vulnerable as they choose to be through what they choose to reveal. But your ability to see through their defenses eliminated this control. You perceived things they didn't choose to show. You understood things they didn't choose to reveal. This loss of control over what you perceived about them created profound vulnerability. They were vulnerable not by choice, but by your perceptiveness, exposed not by their revealing, but by your seeing. This involuntary vulnerability felt more threatening than chosen loneliness, because loneliness at least involves control over their own isolation, while being seen involved loss of control over their vulnerability. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because it required sustained vulnerability that their nervous system experiences as a danger signal requiring escape. The avoidance nervous system has been conditioned through repeated experiences to interpret vulnerability as danger. Closeness triggers anxiety. Being known triggers fear. Emotional exposure triggers a flight response. These aren't conscious choices, but are automatic physiological responses. Being with you while you saw them clearly meant a sustained state of vulnerability that their nervous system experienced as ongoing danger. This created constant low-level anxiety or periodic spikes of intense fear that made being with you physiologically uncomfortable despite consciously recognizing you were safe. Being alone eliminated this danger signal. Their nervous system calmed in isolation, felt safe in defended distance. The choice between loneliness and being seen was a choice between an uncomfortable emotion, loneliness, versus a physiological danger signal, vulnerability, and their system chose loneliness as less threatening. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because it created an expectation for reciprocal vulnerability they feared they couldn't provide, setting up anticipated failure. When you were vulnerable with them, when you shared your authentic self, when you showed your feelings openly, it created an implicit expectation for reciprocal vulnerability. You were open, so they should be open. You were emotionally available, so they should be emotionally available. This expectation felt threatening because they feared they couldn't meet it, couldn't match your vulnerability with equivalent openness, couldn't be emotionally available in ways that reciprocated what you provided. This anticipated failure, knowing you expected reciprocal vulnerability they couldn't provide, felt more threatening than being alone because being alone involved no expectations to fail to meet. Loneliness was more tolerable than living with constant awareness of failing to meet expectations your vulnerability created. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because your perceptiveness meant they couldn't maintain comfortable illusions about themselves and had to face uncomfortable truths. The avoidant maintains various illusions that make their defended life tolerable. Illusions that their independence is an authentic choice, that their patterns are justified, that they're functioning well, that they're not missing anything important by staying defended, but your accurate seeing destroyed these illusions. You reflected back a reality that contradicted their comfortable illusions. Their independence was fear-based. Their patterns were dysfunctional. They were struggling more than they acknowledged. They were missing profound connection by staying defended. Facing these truths was painful and required either changing, which was terrifying, or continuing patterns while consciously recognizing they were problematic, which was psychologically uncomfortable. Being alone allowed them to maintain their illusions without challenge, to believe their defensive narratives without someone reflecting back contradicting reality. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone, because it meant having a witness to their patterns who could hold them accountable in ways they couldn't escape. When no one sees clearly, the avoidant can employ their patterns without accountability. They can withdraw and pretend it's reasonable, can be emotionally unavailable and frame it as personality, can sabotage closeness and deny the sabotage. But you seeing meant having a witness who recognized patterns, who could name them, who could hold them accountable. This accountability felt threatening because it meant they couldn't use their patterns without consequences, couldn't employ defenses without having them identified as defenses. Being alone eliminated accountability. They could use whatever patterns they wanted without a witness who understood what they were doing and why. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because your understanding of their potential created pressure to become that better self rather than remaining comfortable in current dysfunction. You saw not just who they were, but who they could be. You recognized their capacity for depth, for vulnerability, for genuine connection beneath their defended surface. This seeing of potential created an implicit challenge to grow toward it, to develop the capacities you could perceive they had. had. This pressure to grow, to become a better version of themselves, was more threatening than loneliness because growth requires confronting wounds, addressing patterns, doing difficult therapeutic work. Loneliness allowed them to remain as they were without challenge, to stay in a familiar defended state without pressure to evolve. The comfort of stagnation without pressure felt safer than the discomfort of being challenged to grow. Being seen accurately felt more threatening than being alone because your presence while seeing them clearly would mean daily confrontation with the gap between who they are and who they present themselves as being. The avoidant maintains a gap between defended exterior and authentic interior, between who they present themselves as being and who they actually are. Most people only interact with the exterior, so the gap remains private. But your seeing meant you perceived both their defended exterior and their authentic interior, making the gap visible and apparent. Living with you while you saw this gap clearly would mean daily awareness of their own inauthenticity, daily confrontation with the disconnect between their self-presentation and their reality. This constant awareness of their own gap would be psychologically uncomfortable in ways that being alone would avoid by allowing them to maintain the gap without having it reflected back to them constantly by someone who sees it clearly. The avoidant person experienced your perceptiveness not as you being mistaken or misinterpreting them, but as you being dangerously accurate in ways that threaten their entire defensive structure. Understanding how your accuracy created danger reveals why the problem was never your perception, but was their inability to exist in a relationship where they were seen clearly. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you could identify their deactivating strategies in real time, eliminating their effectiveness as defensive tools. The avoidant uses specific deactivating strategies to manage intimacy anxiety, withdrawing emotionally when closeness intensifies, focusing on your flaws when feeling too attached, creating conflict to generate distance, going cold after moments of warmth. These strategies work when the other person doesn't recognize them as strategies and instead responds as if they're genuine responses to legitimate issues. But you recognize them as strategies in real time. When they withdrew, you named it as deactivating. When they focused on your flaws, you recognized it as defensive distancing. This real-time recognition eliminated the strategy's effectiveness. They couldn't create distance through withdrawal if you understood the withdrawal was a defensive strategy rather than a legitimate need for space. Your recognition made their primary defensive tools ineffective, leaving them without their usual methods of managing intimacy anxiety. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you reflected their patterns back to them with accuracy that made denial psychologically untenable. The avoidant maintains their patterns through some level of denial or rationalization, telling themselves the patterns aren't that bad, aren't systematic, are justified by circumstances. But your accurate reflection of their patterns made denial difficult. You named specific behaviors, identified consistent patterns, reflected reality so clearly that denying it would require obvious dishonesty. This elimination of comfortable denial was dangerous because it forced them to either consciously acknowledge their patterns, which created shame and pressure to change, or engage in obviously dishonest denial, which damaged their self-image as an honest person. Your accuracy trapped them between uncomfortable options where all choices were psychologically costly. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you understood the psychological mechanisms behind their behavior better than they understood them themselves. The avoidant often doesn't have conscious awareness of why they behave as they do. They know they withdraw, but don't understand its intimacy, anxiety. They know they go hot and cold, but don't recognize it as approach avoidance conflict. They know they sabotage closeness, but don't see it as fear-driven. But you understood the mechanisms. You could explain their behavior to them in terms of attachment theory, trauma responses, defensive structures. This created a dynamic where you understood them better than they understood themselves, where you had a framework for their behavior that they lacked. This was dangerous because it gave you knowledge and power in the relationship, placed them in the position of being the one who was less psychologically aware, threatened their sense of being in control through superior understanding of dynamics. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you could predict their behavior before they executed it, removing the spontaneity they used as a defense. The avoidance patterns are predictable once recognized. They'll withdraw after intimacy. They'll create distance when closeness intensifies. They'll go cold after warmth. But they experience these patterns as spontaneous responses rather than as predictable patterns. Your perceptiveness allowed you to predict their behavior. You knew they'd withdraw after a vulnerable moment, anticipated they'd create distance after a weekend of closeness, expected they'd go cold after a period of warmth. This prediction was dangerous because it eliminated their sense of spontaneity and made their behavior visible as a pattern rather than as an authentic response. Being predictable to someone else feels like a loss of autonomy and uniqueness, makes them feel mechanistic rather than freely choosing. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you could distinguish between their defended statements and their authentic feelings, eliminating the protection their words provided. The avoidant uses words as a defense, saying they don't care when they do, claiming they want space when they want connection, insisting they're fine when they're struggling. These defended statements work when others take them at face value, but you could distinguish between what they said and what they felt. You knew they cared despite claiming not to. You recognized they wanted connection despite requesting space. You perceived they were struggling despite insisting they were fine. This ability to see through their words to their authentic feelings eliminated the protection their defensive language provided, made them unable to hide behind their words, forced vulnerability through your perception, even when they were trying to maintain defense through their statements. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you responded to their authentic feelings rather than to their defended behavior, making their defenses counterproductive. The avoidance defenses work by creating distance. Withdrawal gets people to stop pursuing. Coldness gets people to back off. Emotional unavailability gets people to stop expecting emotional connection. But you responded to their authentic feelings beneath the defended behavior rather than to the behavior itself. When they withdrew, you responded to the fear driving the withdrawal rather than withdrawing yourself. When they went cold, you responded to the vulnerability they were protecting rather than matching their coldness. This made their defenses counterproductive. Instead of creating distance, their defensive behaviors triggered responses that address their underlying needs, making the defenses ineffective for their intended purpose of managing distance. Your perceptiveness made you dangerous because you held both their wounded self and their defended self in mind simultaneously, preventing compartmentalization they use for self-protection. The avoidant compartmentalizes. They separate their wounded, vulnerable self from their defended, capable self, allowing them to maintain a self-image as strong while keeping wounded parts hidden. But you held both simultaneously. You saw their strength and their wounds, their capabilities and their fears, their defended self and their authentic self at the same time. This prevented compartmentalization. You related to the whole person rather than to just the defended part they wanted to present. This was dangerous because it forced integration they weren't ready for, required them to acknowledge their wounded parts existed alongside their defended parts rather than keeping them separate and hidden.